Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. In this, the third episode in our series Birds of a Feather, we return to the shores of Coal River Penal Settlement, which was indeed a place of harsh punishment in the early years of the 19th century, and where everyone had to struggle to survive in one way or another. The settlement included hardened overseers seeking preferential treatment, authorities who were seeking promotion, and talented convicts who leveraged their skills for recognition and advancement. Narelle Austen looks at the lives of JohnTucker, whose descendants remain in the Hunter Valley to this day, and the writer James Hardy Vaux, who is credited as being the creator of Australia's first dictionary. Their significant cooperation with Commandant Thomas Skottowe offers us a glimpse into a unique time and place in our local colonial history.
In general, the Coal River authorities were not highly motivated elite soldiers. However, they may have been seeking the name for themselves and thereby escaped Coal River through promotion. The overseers were probably also seeking recognition. They were hardened men, long-term and ex-convicts, who would extort whatever they could from the equally hardened criminals. They had to prove that they were tougher than those they controlled. If they could make a name for themselves by exerting their power through intimidation and violence, aided by arms and the lash, the better for them. This was a place where each man and woman had to fend for themselves. On disembarking at this place, which was still referred to as Coal River, the convicts were mustered, the convict indents were read, gangs assigned, and then the prisoners were marched to the huts on the slope of the hill above the pier. The men were mostly assigned to the coal mines, salt pan, timber gangs, or the lime-burning pits. The women were to share those huts with the male convicts. The assignment of convicts to the huts was on an ad hoc basis and could result in the women living at very close quarters with men, regardless of the severity of the crimes they had committed. In Britain, most of the women had been found guilty and transported for committing petty crimes such as stealing items of clothing which they could pawn, stealing household items, including silverware, from their employers, or pickpocketing. Some male convicts, however, had committed violent crimes, including assault, highway robbery with weapons, murder, and rape. And Coal River was established for the punishment of repeat offenders, who were considered to be the worst of the worst. Each new arrival must have been apprehensive to discover who they would be sharing their confined small hut with. The few females were taken to live in the huts which sheltered 5 or 6 men, or in huts further up the slope with the soldiers. None of these men had had access to any women for some time. All of the new arrivals, women and men, had to cope with the attentions of those already in the settlement, who would have watched them very closely. It was not until 1819 that separate barracks were built specifically for the women. Coal River, as its name suggests, was established on the promise of the mining of black diamonds, which was coal. This essential mineral had first been lauded by Joseph Banks on his voyage with Captain Cook in 1770. Coal mining, through the hard labour of the convicts, was to provide a valuable resource to support the settlement and the colony at Sydney. The expensive social experiment of colonisation needed the economic support from the sale of its resources. Newcastle had been founded for its significant natural resources. The first export of coal from Australia, of 150 tonnes, was from Coal River to India in 1801. William Charles Wentworth, in his book, whose title is, in short, A Statistical, Historical and Political Description of the Colony of New South Wales, with a particular enumeration of the advantages which these colonies offer for immigration and their superiority over those possessed by the United States of America, published in 1819, outlined the economic advantages of Coal River, even some years later. It possesses a navigable river by which its produce may be conveyed to market at a trifling expense. It surpasses Port Jackson in the general fertility of its soil and at least rivals it in the salubrity of its climate. It contains in the greatest abundance coal, lime, and many varieties of timber which are not found elsewhere. The summer heats are sufficient for the production of cotton, an inexhaustible source of wealth to the growers, and would afford a valuable article of export to the colony. In addition to the coal seams first spotted by Lieutenant Shortland, Newcastle had other considerable resources: a salt pan of major proportions, ancient oyster middens to be burnt to produce lime for use in construction and shipping, nearby forests of excellent cedar and rosewood, superior soil for food production, grasslands for grazing after levelling the trees, and the local inhabitants who at first cooperated as guides, companions, and trackers of the escaped convicts. In 1804, after the unsuccessful uprising by the Irish in Sydney, the decision was made to re-establish an isolated penal settlement at Newcastle. Lieutenant Charles Menzies arrived at Coal River on the sloop from Sydney, the Lady Nelson, in that year. With him was JohnTucker. The Londoner JohnTucker had been convicted at the Old Bailey in 1789 for feloniously stealing from his employer's London drapery shop while employed as an assistant. A considerable amount of stolen merchandise was found at his parents' house, together with pawn tickets for the rest. At his trial at the Old Bailey in 1789, he immediately confessed and tried to exonerate his parents. "I wish to say that my mother is totally innocent. I imposed upon her by telling her I obtained the goods in the city. I always told her that I bought them. I always told her that I had come by them honestly. I have nothing else to say." As a result of his testimony, in which he claimed full responsibility for the crime, his father was declared innocent. However, his stepmother, Mary Tucker, was found guilty of receiving said stolen goods, sentenced to 14 years, and transported beyond the seas on the Neptune in 1790. John arrived on the Active in 1791. His honourable behaviour towards his stepmother and father was a matter of record from his trial at the Old Bailey, and as London shop assistant it may have been supposed that he had organisational skills. In 1794, JohnTucker married the convict Anne Vaux, with whom he had a son, John, in 1795, and a daughter, Charlotte, in 1797. Despite being a convict, he was a man with shopkeeping skills and an honourable family man who, and after his work in Sydney, gained the trust of the authorities. He was appointed Keeper of the Stores at Coal River in 1804, where he remained in this trusted position throughout the postings of several commandants until 1822. JohnTucker and his family lived and worked in the Hunter Valley from its second inception and remained valued members of the community, for which they were granted land further up the river at Patterson's Plains. JohnTucker is our first example of how the skills of some convicts were selected and rewarded. His descendants are still here today. In John Turner's book, Manufacturing in Newcastle 1801 to 1900, he reports that in 1804, Newcastle Penal Settlement had only 94 convicts. By 1814, there was a convict population of 188, with 149 being male convicts. These numbers exclude the military and their families, the surgeon, visitors, the sailors, and officers working on the supply boats. Just 1 year later, in 1815, the number jumped to 254 convicts who had to be transported, fed, clothed, housed, supervised, recorded, and punished. The stakes for officials at Newcastle seeking success and governmental recognition were high. The promotion of Newcastle, its commandants, and some of its convicts began early and continued. With expansion of the New South Wales colony and its Newcastle settlement, there also came an increasing need for literate and numerate convicts. They were needed by commandants, superintendents, and a few free settlers who themselves could not or did not want to undertake the labour of clerks, bookkeepers, and diarists. A priority in the penal colony in general, and Newcastle settlement in particular, was to involve the employment of convicts to enable the government officials to record, control, publish, glorify, and justify their governance. Governors and commandants needed to promote the production and publication of theirs and the empire's accomplishments. To find people with these skills, they always had to be on the lookout for those convicts who were able to read, write, and calculate. Such a convict was the famous literary artist James Hardy Vaux, who, on his first assignment to Newcastle, worked in the coal mines. On his second transportation, he was to seek a more amenable way to survive by using his knowledge and abilities as he had as storekeeper's assistant on the Hawkesbury River settlement. JohnTucker probably welcomed this strange bird on the southern shore of the Coal River in 1814. In such a place of scarce human resources, a place bereft of people with education who could be useful, Tucker, the superintendent of stores, knew that Hardy Vaux had proven that he could contribute his creative skills to the settlement and therefore be useful to Tucker and his family. Tucker needed help, and Hardy Vaux needed protection. Talented and reliable convicts were given preferential treatment, despite their histories as thieves, swindlers, forgers, and recidivists. Over time, they could gain some recognition by the authorities in the form of tickets of leave, land grants, pardons, and publication of their works. James Hardy Vaux was at Newcastle from 1810 to 1818, with a hiatus of 11 months in which he returned to Sydney. During that short time in Sydney, having nothing to lose as he had been convicted for life, he and 24 others tried to escape from the colony. He claimed, as was his wont, that he was betrayed by a fellow convict as they stowed away. As a result of his capture, he was flogged and banished to Newcastle once more. He was in grave danger, and not just from the harsh work and the infamous guards, but also the vindictive convicts who were incensed at his revelation of their secret language. James Hardy Vaux, also known as Lowe, his mother's maiden name, was born into the upper middle class in London and was the grandson of a famous attorney with rooms in the City of London. He was well educated by his grandparents in London and Shropshire. The private school curriculum at the time included French, Latin, and Greek. His claim to be a gentleman was clouded, however, by the fact that he was the son of a butler, a mayordomo in some of the most prestigious mansions in the land, but still a butler's son. He was a voracious reader, writer, lexicographer, pickpocket, gambler, swindler, charlatan, sailor, escapist, recidivist, and then a lifer. In 1814 at Newcastle, he was about 30 years old. Kel Richards' book, entitled Flash Jim, gives an account of James Hardy Vaux's early life as a privileged child who used his education and connections to gain employment as a legal clerk. However, it seems that perfecting his meticulous copperplate handwriting by copying legal texts and documents did not sustain his interest for long. In short, he soon began to frequent the notorious streets and taverns of the South Bank of London and entered the world of the speakers of flash language, learning their secret family vocabulary from his criminal associates. He was a gambler and needed money to support his habits and lifestyle. His grandfather was an esteemed lawyer and, ironically, one of the governors of Newgate Prison, where he was to find himself sometime later. However, his family finally disowned him. On first being sentenced to Newcastle, James Hardy Vaux made it known that he was literate and so might gain special treatment. Even more importantly, he had extensive knowledge of the flash language spoken by the other convicts. As each colonial commandant was also a magistrate and generally had no understanding of the convict's secret language, Hardy Vaux made himself useful as a translator. He was to help Commandant Skottowe in his role as judicial representative and so avoid hard labour in the coal mines and lime-burning pits. There may have been an emotional connection between the young Commandant Skottowe and Hardy Vaux, as both men were brought up on upper-class family estates and so were well-educated Englishmen. They spoke fluent French. Skottowe was born in France in 1787 and had a French-speaking mother. Hardy Vaux studied in the French school in London, where the children were not allowed to speak English. Both knew London and Plymouth, as they had lived in the centre of the naval establishment at Plymouth and seen battle, an equaliser of most men. Both had had very similar experiences, but were not of the same social rank. In the class-conscious social hierarchy of Britain, pedigree was all. Connections, wealth, and opportunities depended on it. At 24 years old, the ambitious Skottowe was already a commandant in the British colonial forces. Kel Richards, in his book Flash Jim, describes how James Hardy Vaux used his educated accent and fancy clothes to, initially, escape prosecution. Nightly, he attended the theatres and expensive restaurants in Covent Garden. For the culture? Perhaps. He had always been an avid reader and a lover of literature, beginning as a solitary child in his grandfather's library in rural Shropshire. However, as noted by Kel Richards, the theatre was the prime venue where pickpockets could do their most remunerative work amongst the affluent crowds. Who would suspect such a well-dressed, charming, knowledgeable young gentleman? In Flash Jim, Richards recounts a telling anecdote about Hardy Vaux. He was leaving the theatre one evening with his pockets full of pocketbooks and watches when he was surrounded by an angry mob. He used his utmost persuasive powers to pretend to be affronted by their outrageous accusations. He was a gentleman of character and offered to give them his card. Just when things were getting desperate, one of Vaux's old Botany Bay acquaintances turned up. This man had been working the same pickpocket racket in the same theatre, and, like Vaux, had the appearance and the manners of a gentleman of leisure. The man rescued Vaux. Although Hardy Vaux's compilation of the flash language of his fellow petty criminals and convicts is attributed to his time in Newcastle due to his dedication of his lexicon to the patronage of Commandant Skottowe, his history, as exposed in his own memoirs and various biographies, suggests that he had been collecting the 700-word dictionary since he began his early career as a pickpocket and swindler in London. Newcastle's Commandant Skottowe depended on him in his work as magistrate, and therefore gave him time and resources to work on his writing project, avail him of powerful contacts, and have his work finally published in London. James Hardy Vaux may have described his project in the following terms. And Hardy Vaux was a flash cove who blew the gaff on his family. To blow the gaff is to reveal knowledge about someone which is injurious to them. The vocabulary and definitions are available in Hardy Vaux's own dictionary. Richard's book, Flash Jim, and many online sites which have reproductions of his original dictionary list many expressions which entered the general Australian lexicon and stayed, at least until its partial Americanization through television, print media, and the internet. Some words and meanings resonated with me when I read the dictionary. To bolt, to spin a yarn, to sell someone out, to try it on, to snooze, to stash something, to be cleaned out, to cadge, to bash, to be awake to something, a chum, a snitch, a body snatcher, a yokel, a toddler, to be seedy, to be a lush. Some of the late 18th century words have retained their currency and original meanings in Australia to a surprising extent. Others I particularly like just for fun. What or who might be a fingersmith, a slavey, a slop feeder. What could they mean? In the following podcast, we'll hear about the contributions of visual artists Walter Preston and Joseph Lycett, who obtained the patronage of commandants in Newcastle and beyond. Their lithographs, watercolours and sketches remain in museums around the world to graphically depict the lives of convicts, commandants and the First Nations people at a crucial time in our shared history.
That concludes episode 3 of Birds of a Feather. In the next episode, we move from words to images, exploring the artistic legacy of Newcastle's penal settlement and the relationship between Commandant James Wallace and First Nations peoples. Join us again on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.